This took place last year when school had just started, and my only child was in kindergarten. She had been in school for only a few days. We live in a rural area and only have one car, so each morning my daughter, her dad, and I would wake up to take her dad to work. After that, my daughter and I would return home to get ready for school. Since we live on a dead-end dirt road, we have to drive about half a mile down the main road to where her bus picks her up. That morning was going fine. I got her on the bus and headed back home. I had the day off from work, which is normal for me since I only work part-time. I began doing some house cleaning and putting away laundry. I walked into my daughter's room to hang up some clothes in her closet, with the TV on in the living room, which I could see from her room. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like a soft, muffled cough. I froze, not knowing what to do. I stood there, almost paralyzed, as my mind raced. Maybe the cat was outside the window, making a weird noise? Or maybe it was just the TV. Yeah, it was probably nothing. At that point, I was standing in the room, holding a shirt and a hanger, not moving a muscle. I decided I should go next door to get my father-in-law to check it out. I dropped the shirt and hanger and ran to the house next door. Thankfully, my in-laws live just a short distance away, about the length of a football field. My father-in-law is in his mid-60s and uses an oxygen tank, so I wasn't sure what I thought he could do to protect me, but I was really freaked out and didn't want to be alone. He's a hunter and has guns, so I ran faster than I ever had before across our yard and burst through his back door, yelling his name. He came out of the kitchen looking annoyed because I scared him. I was on the verge of tears, trying to explain that something was going on in my house, but I was talking so fast that he couldn't understand me. He tried to calm me down, and I told him I thought someone might be inside the house. He asked if I was sure, and I said yes, begging him to come check it out. He agreed, grabbed his gun, and we got into his truck to head over to my house. I stayed in the truck with the doors locked while he went inside. I was freaking out, scanning my surroundings, and he seemed to be in there for what felt like forever. Finally, he came out and asked if I had left a pack of Newports on the floor in the room near my daughter's bed. I do smoke, but I prefer Camels and have never bought Newports. I told him no, and his eyes widened with a panicked look. He told me to stay in the truck and call the police. He handed me his phone and I dialed 911. The operator said we would have to wait for the state troopers because we lived outside of town. It took about an hour for them to arrive. I had already called my husband at work, and he contacted his brothers to come pick me up. He doesn't work far, so it took about 20 minutes for them to get to me. My father-in-law, husband, and brother-in-law searched the woods surrounding the houses, but there was no one there besides us. After a while, the state trooper arrived, looked around, and found nothing. He took the pack of cigarettes for evidence and took statements from both me and my father-in-law. He told us there wasn't much he could do since I hadn't seen the person and there was no forced entry. Of course, there wouldn't be any forced entry. We live in the middle of nowhere. I felt so foolish, but nobody around here locks their doors. I don't even have a key for the door on my key ring. We just keep it on top of the outdoor fridge as a backup. After the trooper left, my father-in-law gave my husband the gun to keep just in case someone came back. My husband and brother-in-law changed the locks on all the doors that day, and now we keep a key on our key rings and make sure to keep the doors locked at all times. We didn't take our daughter out of school that day because she was only 5, and we thought it might stress her out. We did inform the school to be on the lookout for anything strange and talked with our daughter about stranger danger and what to do if she ever saw someone in the house that she didn't know. I let her sleep in our bed for a few weeks, but she wanted to return to her room because she isn't a baby anymore. Life moved on and nothing happened since. We never heard from the trooper again, and we didn't have any other incidents. I still don't know what that person was planning. Whether they were after me or my daughter or just wanted to rob us, I doubt I'll ever know. I still feel paranoid sometimes and dislike being home alone. My husband got me a dog for company and protection. I hope that, over time, the fear will lessen. Please remember to always lock your doors. No matter how safe you think your neighborhood is, you never know who might be passing through. I used to live in a part of Little Rock, Arkansas that was a bit rough. It was right on the edge of what some might call a sketchy area, but also close to a more remote, empty place. I lived on the outskirts of the city, near the industrial section by Benton. For those who aren't familiar, I was 8 years old when this happened, and my sister was 5 years older than me. We sometimes took walks together, and on this particular day, we ventured further behind the housing development than we ever had before. This part of town was pretty dirty and deserted for such a city. There were train tracks nearby and an industrial plant not far off. A lot of dry, yellow grass pushed through the gravel around the tracks, and people often dumped trash there illegally. There used to be a pack of stray dogs that roamed our neighborhood, but other than that, you wouldn't really see people or cars this far out. We were just walking along the tracks, talking and throwing rocks, when I noticed some odd movement beyond the tree line of a small wooded patch about 40 feet ahead of us, just off to my left. I pointed it out to my sister, and we walked a bit closer to get a better look. When we got to about 10 or 15 feet from the wooded area, we saw what was causing the movement. A mime. Yes, a mime right in the middle of nowhere. He was partially hidden among the trees and tangled dead vines that lined the edge of the woods. He had white face paint, a striped shirt, and black pants. His exaggerated expressions were typical of a mime. His eyes grew wide, and it almost seemed like he started performing for us. It felt like he was trying to lure us in, drawing us closer beyond the wall of vines and into the woods where he was standing, or lurking, really. I can't tell you much more about him because we ran off pretty quickly, but I do remember that it was a scorching day, and his makeup looked smudged and dirty, just like his clothes. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I swear it really happened. Sometimes I wonder who that mime was. I doubt he was out there to kidnap kids, but who knows what might have happened if we'd gone into that thicket. Maybe he was just completely out of his mind, which in a way is even creepier than any stranger you might read about in those kidnapping stories. This story happened about 14 years ago when I was 12 years old, living in the eastern part of an Australian rainforest. Our house was on a 40-acre plot surrounded by bush. The property belonged to a Swiss man named Hans, who occasionally came by with his tractor to cut the long grass around the house, allowing us to explore more of the land. In summer, this was especially useful because, as you might know, Australia has plenty of dangerous creatures. We lived a 40-minute drive from the nearest town, so if we needed groceries, medical help, or wanted to contact our parents while at school, it would take quite a while to get there. The house was built on the side of a large mountain, about 3/4 of the way up, which meant that much of our land was filled with valleys, nooks, and hidden spots. There were trails that led to a stream with a small waterfall that dropped about 5 to 6 meters. It was truly a beautiful place, but also a bit frightening for me and my younger siblings, a brother and sister who were both slightly younger than me. We knew our neighbors on either side of us, but since our house was quite remote, our nearest neighbors were about a 10-minute drive away. One was a sweet elderly lady who would wave to us as we got off the school bus before we walked to our house every day. I think our parents asked her to look after us. The other was a middle-aged man and his family. He was not very nice and often disrupted the stream and waterfall at the border where our properties met. Living out in the middle of nowhere brought its share of strange and creepy experiences, but one in particular involved a man I really didn't want to encounter again. It was rare for us to get visitors we didn't know, usually because they were lost and needed help. One day, however, a man in a utility vehicle came speeding down our driveway. I ran inside to tell my dad that someone odd was here, and he immediately went outside to see who this unexpected guest was. To give you some background, my dad is one of the toughest people you could meet. He lost a leg after an accident on a motorcycle while trying to escape from the police. He served in the Navy and grew up in a strict household, facing challenges in a rough part of Sydney. In short, he was not someone to mess with, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had harmed someone in his past before having kids. So, my dad went outside to see what was happening while my mom kept us inside, protecting us. The man had a large dog in the back of his vehicle that looked like a German Shepherd mix. The dog growled at my dad but backed down when the stranger told it to be quiet. Our own dog, Millie, known for being a fierce protector, was tied up inside the house, barking furiously. The way the man spoke reminded me of a slick salesman, seemingly friendly but with an underlying motive. My dad asked, "What are you doing here? What do you want?" The man seemed surprised, clearly not used to dealing with someone as unfriendly as my dad. They spoke for a while, and I could hear my dad sounding confused about whatever the man was saying. Then I heard my dad say, "What are you thinking? Just call the police." Later, I learned that the kind old lady next to us had passed away. It turned out that the man had visited her property, discovered she was dead, and suggested to my dad that they move her body to make it easier for the police to investigate. My dad, understandably, called the police right away. That night, officers came to take statements from both my dad and the man, who lingered around our house until they arrived. I remember my dad quietly telling one officer that the man wanted to move the body when he first got there. I learned all of this from asking my mom about it at the time and my dad later on. The police left after concluding she had died from natural causes, and the man remained at her house. I found him unsettling. His smile and dark eyes felt off, like he was pretending to be part of our lives. I remember it was a school night, and I was trying to watch TV while he played guitar with my parents at the table. I was annoyed because he was interrupting my shows, so I told my mom I wanted him to go and that I thought he was strange. She smiled and said she felt the same way, telling me to go to bed. The next day felt normal. I went to school and came home, but not seeing the friendly face of the old lady felt strange, and I hoped she knew her family loved her before she passed. I felt a bit sad on my walk home until I noticed the man's vehicle parked in front of her house again. As I got closer, I was greeted by his dog. The man came outside with my dad, and I heard him call the dog as he was leaving, saying he was borrowing tools from my dad. He waved goodbye like he was someone I would miss. That sense of familiarity made me uncomfortable. I didn't know him and didn't like him, and I wished he wouldn't come back to our driveway. My dad pulled me aside and asked what I thought of the man. I told him he was a weirdo and that I hoped he wouldn't return. The next evening, the man showed up again to return my dad's tools. He was in our house playing guitar, annoying everyone. My mom and dad looked visibly unhappy about the situation. I overheard them argue about him being around until my dad finally told him he needed to leave because it was time for us to go to bed. The man insisted it was still early and tried to make excuses to stay, which I found odd. I was polite enough to know when someone wasn't wanted, so I couldn't understand why he wouldn't leave. After my dad ushered him out, he and my mom had a serious discussion in their room. My dad said he didn't like the man and would tell him not to come back anymore. If we ever saw him again, we were to let him know. The next day was a Saturday, and we planned to set up our inflatable pool to go for a swim since it was warm out. Around 11 a.m., I heard a vehicle speeding down the driveway and rushed outside to tell my dad that the man was back. Just like the first time I saw him, my dad went outside while my mom and I stayed inside, watching through the screen door. The man greeted my dad with that odd smile, but my dad said, "Listen, mate, I don't want you coming around here anymore. You scare my kids and my wife, and I don't want you back. Do you understand?" I didn't hear the man's reply, but he sounded confused and tried to reason with my dad. However, my dad wouldn't hear any of it and threatened to call the police. As he was leaving, my dad warned him, "Don't come back, or you'll be sorry." That's when things took a bizarre turn. As my dad made this subtle threat, the man's face shifted to one of fury. He glared at us, stuck up his middle finger, and sped out of the driveway, shouting curses and kicking up gravel toward our house. When my dad returned, he assured us we wouldn't see the man again, and if we did, we were to call the police. I felt relieved. This odd man made me uncomfortable in my own home, and his reaction as he left confirmed my initial feelings about him. I can't remember if it was Sunday or Monday, but the man did return. He tried to apologize to my dad for whatever had caused us to dislike him, but before he even got out of his vehicle, my dad warned him, "If you don't turn around and leave, I'm going to smash your face in." He did just that, calling the police to inform them of what had happened. Apparently, they were going to talk to the man. I didn't hear anything more about that conversation. Weeks went by without any sign of him, and we all felt like things had returned to normal. That was until we found our mailbox tipped over and broken, possibly run over. I asked my dad what happened, but he didn't want to give me any ideas. He later told me he suspected it was the man after the way their last conversation ended. The week after the mailbox incident, we went into town for groceries and a fast food treat. As we drove down our driveway, my dad suddenly stopped my mom from moving forward. He said something felt wrong. Next to the carport where we parked the vehicle, my dad noticed that a bathroom window was open. As we drove in, he grew increasingly tense until we all saw the window was missing. I was confused in the back seat, not understanding what was going on until I caught sight of a familiar figure. Dark eyes and that unsettling smile coming from the bathroom window leading to the shower. My dad exploded with anger and told my mom to hurry down the driveway so we could confront this guy. The man jumped out of the window and took off down our property into the thick underbrush. Even with one leg, my dad let Millie loose since she was going crazy being tied up. She sprinted into the bushes after him, but when she came back, nothing was there. My dad went out with a flashlight but couldn't find anyone either. I'm not sure if anyone slept that night. None of our belongings were stolen or disturbed. We must have caught the man just as he was about to enter our house. The police arrived the next day to search for footprints but found nothing. My dad was furious and alerted them about the man and his odd behavior again. They said, "A close friend of mine had a father who was a violent alcoholic. She didn't live with him as he stayed in a small, isolated seaside town. Occasionally, we would visit him and spend the night. While my interactions with him were unsettling, that's not what this story is about. One evening during one of our visits, my friend and her dad had a huge argument while drunk, and he kicked us out of the house. It was around midnight. We had been dropped off earlier and didn't have a car with us. Her dad's house was about 4 kilometers outside of the town, which consisted of just a couple of shops, reachable by a dirt road. We started walking down the road towards town, where there was a public phone booth. This was before mobile phones were common, so I planned to call my parents, who lived about an hour and a half away, to come pick us up. As we walked, my friend was drunkenly crying and lamenting her broken relationship with her father, and she didn't stop the entire way. When we finally got to the phone booth, we sat on the bench next to it. I called my parents, waking them up, and they agreed to come get us. We settled down to wait for them to arrive. Not long after, a van pulled up and parked behind the bench, only about 5 meters away. There were 2 young men in the front seats, and they were staring at us. If that wasn't unsettling enough, the sliding door of the van opened, revealing more guys sitting in the back. I couldn't tell how many, but there were at least 2 or 3 more. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were no houses, no people, and no cars passing by. It was an isolated, desolate area. I stood up, keeping my eyes on the van, aware of how vulnerable we were. The men started talking among themselves, quietly at first, then louder. It became clear that they wanted us to hear them. They were talking about pulling us into the van and doing terrible things to us, then killing us. I can't remember their exact words, but that was the essence of it. I was shaking with fear, unable to take my eyes off them. I still remember one of the men's faces so vividly I could draw it today. He was sitting in the door of the van, staring at me with cold, emotionless eyes, like I was just an object to him. Meanwhile, my friend was still sobbing to herself, seemingly unaware of the van or the danger we were in. I was so terrified I couldn't even speak to warn her. Then something unbelievable happened. My friend's dad, who never apologized or backed down from anything, suddenly showed up in his car, also drunk. I can't describe how unlikely this was. He could hold a grudge like no one else, and he was as stubborn as they come. But there he was. He and my friend had a tearful reunion, all while I kept my eyes glued to the van. The men had stopped talking and were just watching us. "Let's go," I said, and we got into the car. As we drove away, the van started following us. I tried to explain what was going on to my friend's dad, but he just shrugged it off, saying he'd slow down so they could pass. But they didn't pass. They slowed down too, following us closely, shouting threats out of their windows. They trailed us the entire way down the dirt road, and then followed us all the way to my friend's dad's house. Once there, they parked behind us and just sat in the van. We were terrified. All of my friend's dad's neighbors were away, and no one was around to help us. We knew that if those men decided to make good on their threats, there would be no one to come to our aid. After what felt like forever, the van finally backed out of the driveway and drove off. When my parents arrived in a panic, they had gone to the shops first but couldn't find us there. My friend's dad was embarrassed, and we went back to my house with my family. People have asked if I reported the incident to the police, but I honestly can't remember. That period of my life was such a mess. What I do know is that experience changed me permanently. I've become much more fearful and extremely protective of my children. But I don't want to change, because I'd rather be overly cautious than ever risk trusting the wrong person. This happened about 15 years ago when I was 13. I was at a summer camp with my scout group, which included both boys and girls. In Spain, scouting is a bit more relaxed and open-minded. One of the most important activities during our summer camp was what we called the raid, which meant leaving the camp for a few days to hike and explore. My friends and I planned an exciting route through a beautiful mountain range called the Cantabrian Mountains in the north of Spain. The plan was to hike for 3 days and spend 2 nights camping. Our group had 14 kids, aged between 13 and 15. We had food, knew how to read maps, build shelters, find water, and survive for a few days on our own. Back then, no adults came along with us, which doesn't happen anymore. Our plan for the first day was to climb a mountain that was just under 9,000 feet and camp by a glacial lake near the top. It was a long hike from our main camp, about 12 miles and quite steep. By around 6 p.m., we realized we wouldn't reach the lake in time. So we found a nice spot to build a shelter, cooked some dinner, and settled in. We were in the middle of a stunning mountain, at least 6 miles from the nearest road and even farther from the nearest village. We couldn't have been happier. After dinner, with nearly 2 hours before sunset, we decided to send a smaller group to clean the dishes and refill water at a spring we had passed earlier. I volunteered, along with 3 other friends. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, just in case, and headed out. As we were walking back, night fell. We could hear our friends singing and laughing in the distance, but then one of my friends suddenly stopped and pointed out something on the side of the trail. "This wasn't here when we came down," he said. It was a reflective post from the road, broken into pieces. Our relaxed mood vanished, and we rushed back to camp. We told the others about what we had found, and fear quickly spread. Who could be out here in the mountains with us, and why? 2 of the older boys, both 15, decided to check the area to calm everyone down. They took a flashlight, a knife, and a whistle so we could hear if they needed help. The rest of us stayed huddled in our shelter, which was just a few tarps held up by sticks near a large rock. The atmosphere was tense. I remember hearing a lot of quiet sobbing around me, and I kept thinking, I don't want to die here. One girl suggested we sing to distract ourselves. Some disagreed, worried we wouldn't hear the whistle, but we sang quietly anyway. About 10 to 20 minutes later, we were interrupted by the sound of 2 whistles coming fast toward us. I pulled my knife from its case and held it tightly. Luckily, it was our friends. They were out of breath and panicked. They told us they had found a long stick covered in blood, which was more than they could handle. Most of us started crying, and some began to pray. They said they were going back to confront whoever was out there, and if things went bad, we should run. We begged them to stay, but no one had the courage to stop them. There was no more singing, just quiet sobbing and silent prayers. I remember thinking, I'd rather fight than be killed in this awful place. We sat in silence, knives ready, waiting. Minutes later, we heard footsteps and people running toward us, followed by terrified screams. More than 2 people were approaching us. I'd never been so scared. I held my knife, ready to defend myself. When we finally saw them, it was our 2 friends being chased by 2 men. The men stopped in front of our shelter, and we saw their faces. They were our camp leaders who had been following us all along, hiding. They burst out laughing and asked if we had been scared. It was all just a joke. Everyone started crying again, this time out of relief mixed with anger. It took the leaders a while to realize the seriousness of what they had done. They had pushed 12 kids to the point where we were ready to fight for our lives with knives. We eventually relaxed, but we were furious. The joke had gone too far, and their apologies didn't matter. We didn't want them around, but we were still too scared to sleep alone, so we reluctantly let them stay with us that night. It took months for us to trust them again. That night was the worst of my life, no doubt about it. Even though I don't have nightmares about it, I remember it as if it happened yesterday. Now that I'm older, I often wonder what would have happened if those 2 men had really been dangerous. We were just kids, but we were armed and ready to defend ourselves. I'm a journalist now, and I can't help but think about the headlines. 2 men stabbed by a group of 12 kids in the mountains. Things were different back then, and scouting has changed for the better since. I live in a small town of about 12,000 people in rural Minnesota. Not by choice, but for work, we were planning to move once I found a better job. One day, I was heading to my boss's house, where he runs the business from his basement until we get a proper office space. On the way, I was being tailgated aggressively by a beat-up blue car, driven by a bald white man. I drive a Kia Soul, which has a flat back end, so if I can't see your headlights, you're only a few inches behind me, and I'll start tapping my brakes. He did that and then honked at me. I didn't care, flipped him off, and slowed down to 5 miles below the speed limit. There weren't any cars behind me, so I wasn't bothering anyone else. He had opportunities to pass me on the country road, but he didn't. After a few minutes, with no cars around and him still tailgating me at 50 miles an hour, I grabbed my phone and acted like I was taking a quick picture of him. Then I pretended to call the police. Being in the middle of nowhere with no one else around made me uneasy, and this guy was starting to freak me out. I reached my turn but decided to see if he'd keep following me. I turned left, and sure enough, he followed. I approached a roundabout and thought I could lose him there. I drove around it twice, but he was still right behind me. By then, I knew he was messing with me, trying to scare me. I decided I'd rather be late for my meeting than deal with this creep, so I headed for the police station. He followed me all the way there. I parked, ready to run inside, but to my surprise, he parked right next to me. He just stared at me, pulling up so close to my side of the car that I could barely open my door. He looked like he was in his 40s, wearing sunglasses and a disturbing smile. His clothes were neat, nothing threatening there, and the inside of his car was spotless. I started thinking he might have a weapon. I should mention that I'm trained in behavior analysis, and while I mostly work with kids, I have an interest in criminal behavior and profiling. I was trying to read this guy as best as I could. After a few seconds, I picked up my phone again, this time actually intending to call 911. As I dialed, he rolled down his passenger window, didn't say a word, rolled it back up, and sped off. I went inside and told an officer what happened. Unfortunately, I was too focused on not crashing to get his license plate number. The officer mentioned that there had been several complaints recently about tailgaters, many involving a blue car. I filled out a report, and they gave me a card for victim services and a local women's shelter, just in case he followed me home and I didn't feel safe. I live in a secure building with my fiancée, so I wasn't too worried. But when I went out to my car later, I found a note on the windshield. All it had was a smiley face straight out of a horror movie. I took it back inside, and the officer said he'd call me a few times that night to check in and advised me not to go anywhere alone for a while. He did call twice and mentioned that he'd be patrolling my parking lot during his night shift. This is a small town where people tend to look out for each other, so I feel confident that if I see this guy again, someone will back me up. No doubt, I'll call 911 and head straight to the police station again. I've also told my fiancé that I'll text him whenever I leave work or have to go out, and if I don't message him within 10 minutes of when I'm supposed to arrive, he should call 911. In September 2011, my boyfriend Dan, his best friend Tom, my best friend Sarah, and I were all heading back to her hometown for her final year of college after spending the summer in Paris. We had an amazing time staying in my aunt's apartment, partying, and exploring the city. It was a great experience. That night, we stopped at a small inn about halfway home, planning to arrive by around 6 p.m. the next day. We woke up early, probably around 5 a.m., ready to get on the road again, only to find that someone had clipped our car and knocked off the right side mirror. Since the car was a gift from my dad and I'd only had it for 2 months, I was furious. We asked the owner of the inn if she knew where we might find a replacement. She mentioned a makeshift scrapyard she had seen nearby, though she wasn't sure it was still there. She sketched us a rough map, and we got back on the road, unsure if her directions were even right. As we neared the area she marked, the surroundings became more remote. The paved roads turned to dirt, and the farms faded into overgrown fields and small patches of forest. It all felt a bit eerie, but we decided to push on, despite the isolation and my growing unease about driving without a side mirror. Just when we were about to give up, Dan pointed to a handwritten sign up ahead, "Cafe and Car Parts, 2 miles." We followed the sign to a small cove surrounded by trees and got out of the car, except for Sarah, who stayed asleep in the back seat. In front of us was a tiny cream-colored shack with cafe, spray painted on the roof, a rundown caravan, and a pile of scrap metal and car parts. As expected, we were the only ones there. The sun was up, but no lights or signs of activity were around. It was still early, about 6 a.m. We walked over to the scrap pile and started rummaging through it, hoping to find a replacement mirror. Tom picked up an old, rusty mirror, at least a decade old, and suggested we just take it and go. But I, being overly honest, insisted that we pay for it. I knocked on the door of the shack and waited. A tall, rough-looking man opened the door. At first, he looked irritated, like we'd woken him up. But then he smiled, revealing a gap-toothed grin. He stared at me for a few seconds before noticing the guys approaching. Tom handed him the mirror and asked how much he wanted for it. The man waved it off, saying it was free, but that he wanted to get to know us better. Seemed strange, but we shrugged it off. Just then, 2 more men came out from the back of the shack. They were bald, with rotting teeth, and reeked of something awful. The first man told them to help attach the mirror to our car. He introduced himself as John and invited us to sit on the patio chairs outside, offering us sandwiches. I politely declined, but he insisted we must be hungry and suggested that I come inside to make the sandwiches myself, claiming women were better at it. I refused again, now finding him rather offensive, and Dan firmly backed me up. The mood quickly became uncomfortable. John started asking questions, at first innocent ones like our ages and where we were from, but then he began asking inappropriate and personal questions about my relationship with Dan. We didn't answer, and the tension grew. Suddenly, we heard Sarah scream from the car. One of the men who was supposed to be fixing the mirror had reached through the back window and grabbed her leg. The other man was nervously glancing around. We jumped up and ran to the car. Tom chased after the men, but they disappeared into the trees. Sarah was hysterical, having woken up to a stranger's hand on her leg. I sat with Sarah in the back seat to calm her down while Dan got in on the other side. He noticed a bunch of nails scattered in front of our tire, as if they were trying to flatten it. It was all too much. Mirror or not, we needed to leave. Tony was the last to get in, and as he closed the door, we saw John come out of the shack holding something long in his hands. As he got closer, I realized it was a hunting rifle. Panic surged through me, and I started the car, slamming the accelerator. We sped off, not caring about the rough dirt roads. We didn't slow down or stop looking behind us until we were safely back on the main highway. To this day, whenever I visit Paris, I always take the train. I never want to risk running into them again. When I was 20, I worked for a company that sent laborers to rural areas of New Zealand. Basically, you'd let them know when you were free, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks to do whatever work was needed. It was tough labor, long hours, but if you got lucky with the group of workers, it could be fun too. This happened when I was working on a massive property. I was told it covered about the same area as Delaware, USA, and it was a 9-hour drive from Wellington. The farm itself was around 40 minutes from the nearest small town, which meant we were really out in the middle of nowhere. My job was clearing bushland along with 3 other guys who were my age, also from the city. Our boss was a man named Steve, who owned the property and supervised us, though he wasn't shy about getting his hands dirty with the work. Steve was pretty easygoing and generally treated us well. That particular summer was scorching, and the work was brutal. One afternoon, when the temperature reached about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, Steve gave us the rest of the day off. He mentioned a swimming hole on the property, about a 25-minute drive to the north. I was excited for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to rest. So, Steve and I hopped into one of the work trucks and headed out across the farm. The land was mostly wide, empty spaces with patches of scattered trees. Steve wasn't much of a talker, so we drove mostly in silence. After about 20 minutes, he suddenly perked up, poking me in the ribs. "Do you see that? By the 2 dead trees over there." I should explain that in these inland areas, especially in New Zealand, the landscape is usually brown or red and very flat. It's pretty featureless, so anything bright or unusual stands out. So, you can imagine how shocked we were when we saw a large blue structure in the distance. We steered toward it, and as we got closer, we realized it was a massive blue shipping container, just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Steve was just as confused as I was. I asked him if he knew what it was, but he didn't have a clue. He mentioned that it wasn't there the last time he had been through that area, just 5 weeks ago. He was curious and wanted to check it out. We parked about 100 meters away, but at this point, I had a really bad feeling. It's hard to explain, but seeing something so out of place in the middle of nowhere just felt wrong. Steve, however, wanted to investigate, which made sense since it was his land. but I was really nervous. As we got closer, things got even stranger. Behind the container was a diesel generator, humming away, and there were security cameras on each side of the container, all of them tracking our movements as we walked around. I tried to talk Steve out of going any further, saying something like, "With all this security, someone clearly doesn't want us here. Let's go." But he brushed me off, reminding me it was his property, and whoever put this here was trespassing. He was determined to see what was inside. Despite all the cameras and security, the only thing keeping the door locked was a small padlock. Steve had bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after some effort, we broke the lock and opened the door. The first thing I noticed was the rush of cold air. It was air-conditioned inside, which was a relief given how hot it was outside. We fumbled around looking for a light switch, but I could already tell it was some kind of tech setup. There were blinking LEDs all over the place, and I could hear the familiar hum of hard drives at work. When we finally found the light switch, we saw a sophisticated, albeit cluttered, office setup. There were hard drives the size of mini fridges and various pieces of computer equipment lining the walls, stacked 2 or 3 high in some places. Plastic storage boxes were scattered around, and there were several desks in the center with computer monitors and rolling office chairs. At this point, it felt like we had walked into some bizarre dream. None of it made any sense. We sat down at one of the desks to see if the computers could give us any clues about what this was. My heart was pounding, and all I wanted to do was get out of there. We had been spotted by the cameras, so whoever was watching knew we were there. But Steve was determined to figure it out, so I tried to play along. We fumbled around with the computers, but neither of us knew much about technology beyond basic stuff like email or social media. From what I could tell, the computers were constantly downloading and transferring data, just like those old file-sharing programs. There were several windows open, all displaying endless streams of data being logged. I gave up on the computers and decided to check out the storage boxes stacked at the far end of the container. By this point, I was sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide. Still, I was on edge. Against my better judgment, I started looking through the boxes. What I found made me feel sick to my stomach. Inside one of the boxes were posters, DVDs, and photos, all of them containing disturbing and illegal material involving children. It was all meticulously organized into folders and small containers, which made it even more horrifying. I immediately backed away and ran over to Steve, barely able to speak. I blurted out something like, "Mate, we need to leave now. This is messed up. We need to go." I managed to explain what I saw, and we jumped into the truck, speeding back to the house. The farm had no mobile reception, and we hadn't brought any satellite phones, so we had to use the landline to call the police. It took the cops nearly an hour to get to the farm since the nearest station was a long drive away. While we waited, we were both in shock, talking frantically about what we had just discovered. When the police finally arrived, we took them back to the container. But by the time we got there, the door was wide open, and the inside was on fire. We had 2 small fire extinguishers, but they were no match for the blaze. The fire department took an hour to arrive, and by then, most of the container was destroyed. A federal investigation later determined that almost all of the computer equipment had been removed before the fire was set, leaving behind only traces of paper and cardboard. Whoever was running this operation had been watching us the whole time, and they'd had enough time to get away before the police arrived. Despite the investigation, nothing ever came of it, and the case went cold. I kept in touch with Steve, and the shipping container still sits there on the property. It's too costly to move, but I'll never forget what I found inside those boxes.